Treasurer, can we switch to the mining tax now and your $38 million advertising campaign? The opposition says you put spin ahead of policy. Do you regret using $38 million of public money to promote this tax?
I don't make any apologies whatsoever for having a public information campaign. And can I just go through some of the reasons? This is a very big tax reform. The government decided on a very big package to strengthen our economy, to modernise resource taxation, to cut the company tax rate, to give an early start for small business, to put in place a $5,000 instant deduction, if you like, for small business, to put in place a $1,000 tax discount on interest, a 50% tax discount on the first $1,000 of interest earned. A very big range of reforms here, Fran, which do justify a public information campaign, because these reforms will strengthen our economy for the long term.
But Treasurer, isn't the time for a public information campaign is when the tax reforms are in place? I mean, how do you justify applying for an urgent exemption from the rules to run these ads when there was no guarantee that these reforms would even be passed into law? In fact, it became pretty obviously pretty soon that they had little chance of that.
Fran, it's not unusual for governments to put public information campaigns in place and alongside the announcement of very significant tax reforms. There is plenty of precedent for that in our history, and that is the responsible thing to do, because I announced very substantial tax reforms on the 2nd of May. The government took the view prior to that announcement that there was and would be a need for a substantial public information campaign, and we began developing that campaign. All that has occurred here is that that campaign has been brought forward as a consequence of a massive misinformation campaign which has been put forward by the mining industry. They are said to have in the war chest up to $100 million to spend. I think it's very important that the public has an accurate view of what the government is planning in terms of replacing the royalties regime with a super profits tax, what the government is planning to do in terms of cutting the company tax rate, what the government is planning to do in terms of providing additional incentives for small business, what the government is planning to do to boost superannuation savings. All of these things are absolutely critical that there is accurate information, and that is in the national economic interest.
In the name of accuracy, though, Treasurer, in fact, it's not true to say this campaign was brought forward. I've got a copy of the letter that you wrote to the Minister for Secretary of State, Joe Ludwig, on May the 10th, which shows that you were planning to start. You wanted urgent dispensation to launch this campaign on the 30th of May, which is what happened. This was always planned. This is not in response to a campaign of misinformation.
No, let's be very clear. We launched the tax reform proposals on the 2nd of May. Even before that, we had some of the scare campaign coming from the mining industry. But in the week that followed that, we had one miner say that he was cancelling projects, and the next day buying shares in his mining company. We had Mr Palmer on the public record saying he was cancelling projects in South Australia, projects that didn't exist. We had paid advertising from the Minerals Council of Australia. It was very clear as we went through that week that there was going to be a massive misinformation campaign from the mining industry.
With respect,
and
Treasurer,
on the basis of that, I wrote to Senator Ludwig.
On the basis of that, it was before the budget was launched. So, whatever the strength of the mining campaign against your tax was, it was just an initial signs of that. On the strength of that, you asked for special dispensation to spend $38 million of taxpayers' money. I mean, where is the urgency in that? Surely that's the time for government ministers, including yourself, to get out on the front foot and start explaining the tax. You don't need an advertising campaign to do that.
Well, certainly we've been getting out on the front foot and explaining the tax, and it is the case that we put the monies in the budget. That was there for all to see. On the 11th of May, there wasn't much comment about all of that, and what unfolded, unfortunately, is what I thought would unfold. A massive misinformation campaign from the mining industry, estimated to be as big as $100 million. And the signs of that were there from the 2nd of May on the day that we made the announcement. Now, Fran, I think it's just naive if anybody thinks that some of the biggest companies in the world, some of the biggest mining companies in this country, are simply going to lie down and agree to pay a bit more tax. The fact is that they are affected by this tax. There is a very strong case for them to pay more, a very strong case for the Australian people to get a fair share, and the government is going to put forward its case because it is absolutely essential to economic reform and to strengthening our economy for the long term, and we will not be deterred by this huge war chest of the mining industry.
So even at the cost of breaking a core promise, the Prime Minister described political advertising used in this way as a cancer on democracy, even at the risk of breaking a core promise just to fend off a bit of a scare campaign.
Fran, I don't accept for one moment the characterisation that you have just made. What we are doing is putting in place an information campaign. It is absolutely essential to taking forward all of the reforms that I've described to you earlier. They are very substantial reforms for Australia. It is entirely legitimate to have a public information campaign about those reforms. We've brought it forward, and those reforms are out there for all Australians to see. And of course, you've got the mining industry that is engaged in a robust way with its $100 million war chest. It's very important, and I believe in the national interest, for the Australian government to put its point of view, given the determination of the mining industry to mount this misleading campaign.
It's 11 to 8 on Breakfast. Our guest this morning is the Treasurer, Wayne Swan. Treasurer, to the tax itself and the progress of the consultations with the mining industry. You received a progress report from your consultation panel on Friday. What does it recommend?
Well, it's just a progress report on the meetings that they've had with companies so far, and those meetings will continue as we go through the weeks ahead. I think the consultations have been valuable. We are getting very good feedback from the companies, and we're taking that on board. We are genuine about the consultation process, but we will not be in any way reacting to or giving into the mining industry scare campaign. We are determined, absolutely determined, to proceed with this tax, which will ensure that the Australian people get a fair share of the mineral resources which they own 100%.
Does this report, this interim report, recommend, for instance, the abolition of the 40% underwriting of losses? Because that's something all the miners we've spoken to here on Breakfast say they don't want.
Well,
even
Fran,
the small miners don't want it.
I'm not going into the detail of what has come through out of that consultation report, but the government is absolutely determined to proceed with the tax within the framework that I outlined on the 2nd of May. And that framework has great integrity. We will take on board feedback from the industry. I've said that from day one as well. And many companies are providing that feedback in a constructive way.
Treasurer, can you point to one mining company that likes the underwriting of losses? Because we've looked and we can't find one.
I can point to plenty of companies that are engaging in a constructive way in the consultations. I'm not going to outline the names of those companies on your program, but I can say that we are making substantial progress through those consultations.
Will we have a firmer idea of this tax, the makeup of this tax package, of this particular tax reform, before the election?
Well, Fran, I'm not putting a time limit on it. I've made it very clear.
It's pretty important, isn't it?
Well, I made it very clear on the 2nd of May that our bottom line was that through this super profits tax, we would get a fair share for the Australian people. We would put in place a framework which would encourage investment and growth in the resource sector. We would put in place tax reforms elsewhere in the economy which would deal with the challenges of the two-speed economy. That's what we're doing. That's what we're determined to do, even in the face of this $100 million onslaught from the mining industry.
And just briefly, Treasurer, a news poll today has Labor with a primary vote of 35%. Is it possible for Labor to retain government with that number?
Fran, we don't govern in terms of the fortnightly cycle of news poll. What we
you
have
must be
to
worried
do,
about it, though, falling support like that.
I'm not in any way worried or whatever about opinion polls, because what we are doing is in the national economic interest. It's the right thing to strengthen our economy for the future, and I believe that will be rewarded by the Australian people at the next election.
Treasurer, thanks very much for joining us on Breakfast.
Thank you.